Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got quite a pile of sources here today. We're looking at articles, research reports, even some, discussions from online communities,
Hmm.
and they're all pointing towards a really, really important topic, one that often stays hidden: coercive control.
That's right. And this specific set of materials, it gives us a particular angle, focusing on understanding this really complex abuse, the signs, the impact,
Yeah.
and especially, how to navigate things when men are the victims, sometimes with women as the perpetrators, which is a focus in these sources.
Exactly. So our mission today is to kind of sift through all this, pull out the really crucial bits, the essentials from these sources,
Right.
so you can get a handle on what coercive control actually is, how it shows up, the damage it does, particularly when men experience it, and importantly, what paths forward these sources might suggest.
Yeah, it's a deep dive that feels, well, pretty necessary.
Okay, then let's unpack this. We hear the term coercive control, but what do these sources actually tell us it means, fundamentally?
Well, the definitions are, pretty consistent across the board here. And they definitely paint a picture of something much more insidious than just, say, occasional arguments or bursts of anger. Healthline, for example, uses some really strong language. They call it a strategic form of ongoing oppression and terrorism used to instill fear.
Wow, terrorism. That really underscores the severity, the intention behind it. It's not random then.
Not at all, no.
Hmm.
The hard truth material in a workshop summary we looked at, they really stress that this is a pattern of behavior. It's calculated,
Right.
it's designed, systematically to dominate the other person, to isolate them, and just erode their sense of self, their independence, their autonomy.
So it's not just about a single fight or shouting match. It's more like a sustained campaign.
Precisely. And a really critical point these sources make is that, look, physical violence can be part of it. Absolutely.
Sure.
But coercive control often relies really heavily on nonviolent tactics,
Mhm.
used consistently over time. It's the systematic nature of it that kind of builds the prison, not necessarily, the physical force.
That's interesting. And the UK actually took pretty big step on this, legally speaking.
They did, yeah. Both Healthline and the UK report mentioned this. The UK criminalized coercive control back in 2015,
Mhm.
which was pretty groundbreaking at the time.
But even with that law in the books, the sources seem to suggest that proving it, especially maybe in family court, is still incredibly difficult.
Oh, absolutely. That's a theme that comes up again and again. In the hard truth piece, those Reddit discussions, the workshop info,
Yeah.
it's just unlike, say, a physical assault where you might have visible injuries, proving a pattern of psychological manipulation or financial control or isolation. Well, that can be notoriously tough in court, often gets dismissed or maybe just not fully understood.
Right. So if it is this pattern, how do you even start to recognize it? What are the specific signs these sources tell us to look for?
Well, the sources, especially Healthline and that UK report, they list quite a range of tactics abusers use. A major one is isolation.
Okay.
And this isn't subtle, usually. It's actively limiting your contact with friends, with family, sometimes fabricating lies about you to turn people against you, or monitoring your calls, your messages,
Yeah.
or just constantly trying to convince you that your support system, the people who care about you, actually hate you or are somehow bad for you.
So they're basically trying to dismantle your safety net, your outside support.
Exactly. Then there's denying freedom and autonomy. This can look like controlling where you go, restricting access to transport, maybe even stalking your movements,
Wow.
taking your phone, changing passwords without telling you, stopping you from working or studying. Really anything that limits your independent life and your ability to potentially leave.
That just sounds incredibly suffocating.
It is. And sort of central to it all is the psychological abuse. Gaslighting is a classic tactic here.
Right. I've heard that term a lot.
Yeah, it's basically making you doubt your own memory, your perceptions, sometimes even your sanity. Healthline gives this really simple but powerful example. Arguing intensely that they asked for steak when you know they asked for burgers. And they just keep at it until you actually start to question yourself, maybe even apologize. It's about always needing to be right and making you feel fundamentally wrong or confused or even like you're going crazy.
That really shows how it can work on that sort of subtle, everyday level.
It does. And beyond the gaslighting, it's, constant criticism, putting you down, name-calling. The UK report lists things like using nasty looks or gestures, showing you up in public, telling you you're going mad, just playing relentless mind games.
So, undermining connections, freedom, your own mind. What about money? Financial
No.
control.
Oh, that's huge. limiting your access to money, maybe controlling your earnings entirely, refusing to share finances fairly, running up debt in your name, or even preventing you from having a job at all. Both Healthline and the UK report point to economic abuse as a key tactic. It just creates this dependency.
And Healthline also mentioned something about reinforcing traditional gender roles.
Yes, that can be another tool for control. Trapping a partner in really rigid expectations about, say, housework, childcare, or limiting their life outside the home based on these outdated gender norms.
Okay. And finally, threats and intimidation seem to feature heavily too.
They do, threatening to harm you or themselves or maybe others like children or pets, threatening to leave, which can be terrifying if you've been made dependent,
Yeah.
threatening to expose embarrassing or private information about you. The UK report adds things like damaging your property, being nasty to your friends or family, even venting anger on pets. Anything, really, that creates this ongoing sense of a credible threat, even if it's not direct physical violence at you.
Those are incredibly detailed tactics. But,
Yeah.
when we think about who experiences this, the narrative has often been quite one-sided.
Right. Traditionally, yeah, the focus has often been very heavily on male perpetrators and female victims. And look, that's a crucial and very real aspect of domestic abuse, absolutely.
Of course.
However, this is where the sources you shared get really interesting, and they challenge that single story. They state quite clearly that anyone can be a victim of coercive control.
And the UK report specifically, along with that workshop info, really spells out that men can absolutely be victims and women can be perpetrators.
Yes, the UK research is quite striking here. It actually found that male and female victims of intimate partner violence seem equally likely to experience highly controlling behaviors from their partners.
Wow, equally likely.
That's a direct finding cited in the UK report, and it's based on multiple studies.
That really pushes back against some of those older ideas like what some researchers called patriarchal terrorism, which focuses specifically on male control rooted in, patriarchal structures. While that definitely exists, these sources show it's broader than that.
Exactly. And the UK report points out a pretty significant reason why the data might look skewed towards male perpetrators sometimes.
Which is?
Well, a lot of data comes from places like women's shelters or police arrest records. And while that data is vital, it can give an incomplete picture because, frankly, female perpetrators might not be recognized as abusers as often or arrested as frequently.
Yeah, okay.
There's actually a quote in the report from someone named Candela highlighting this issue. It makes it hard to get a really accurate measure of how often men are the victims.
So let's dive into that specifically then. What unique aspects or tactics do these sources highlight when coercive control is used against men?
This is where that UK report gives some really critical gender-specific details. A major vulnerability that female perpetrators exploit is the male victim's relationship with his children.
Ah, okay.
This isn't just used for control during the relationship, but it's especially weaponized post-separation. Threatening access, using the kids as pawns.
Oh.
It's an incredibly powerful lever to pull.
I can imagine that being just devastatingly effective. And that statistic on false allegations really jumped out at me from the sources.
It's highlighted as a key gender-specific tactic in the UK survey. Almost two-thirds. Think about that. Nearly 66% of the male victims in that survey experienced false allegations, or even just the threat of them,
Wow.
often to the police or social services, used as a consistent pattern of abuse. That's a uniquely potent weapon against men, often playing on societal biases or fears.
That's a staggering number.
Yeah.
Were there other tactics the UK report identified as being particularly aimed at male victims?
Yeah, things like being degraded about their salary, their life choices, their job performance, kind of undermining their role as provider, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Economic abuse against men could also include controlling their earnings or sometimes even forcing them to go to work when they're unwell, just maintaining that control over their financial input.
And the sources also mentioned sexual coercion against men. That's something we don't often hear about.
No, we don't. But the UK report details it quite clearly. Over 1 in 5 men in their survey reported being forced to penetrate their partner as a pattern of abuse.
Really?
Yes. 2/3 reported sex being withheld as a form of punishment. Men also face threats of false allegations of sexual abuse being made against them.
Gosh.
And, disturbingly, partners stopping contraception without their knowledge, leading to forced fatherhood, was mentioned as another method of control. These are very specific, often completely unacknowledged, forms of sexual control used against men.
So it's not just the general tactics being applied across the board, but specific ways those tactics are kind of weaponized based on the victim's gender and maybe societal expectations around men.
Absolutely. And the impact of all this.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just theoretical. The sources reveal it's profound, just devastating for male victims.
The UK report talked about that loss of freedom.
Yes, the coercive control severely restricted male victims' sense of choice, their freedom, their ability to just act independently, and the psychological toll was immense.
How bad was it?
It wasn't just, feeling a bit down. It was described as being of clinical concern for 8 out of 10 men in that UK survey. 8 out of 10.
Wow.
And the data showed a clear link. The higher the level of abuse they endured, the higher their level of psychological distress.
What did that distress actually look like? What were the impacts?
Well, the psychological impacts reported really mirror what we often see in other trauma survivors.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety, depression, PTSD. The Reddit discussions specifically brought up CPTSD, that's complex PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
which tends to result from ongoing repeated trauma, not just a single event.
Right.
And tragically, suicide ideation was also reported as a consequence in both the UK report and Healthline.
Looking at the qualitative data from those UK surveys, the actual words men use to describe their experience are really telling, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Gives you this unique window. Words like family, children, obviously control, trapped, money, courts, lost, isolation, but also depression, stressful, anxiety, threatened, and crucially, allegations. These were incredibly prominent. It really shows you where the pressure points were for them.
And the report seemed to draw a distinction in how men describe their feelings, maybe compared to what we might typically assume about abuse victims.
It did, yeah. It was interesting. While fear is, of course, a common response to abuse, the report noted that men in this survey often described the impact using terms like depression, helplessness, anxiety, stress, feeling trapped. Perhaps more often than they described just general fear of their partner.
Huh.
When fear was reported, it was frequently tied to very specific threats from the abuser, like the fear of losing their kids or the fear of facing those false allegations we talked about.
Okay.
It sort of suggests the abuse was targeting these specific vulnerabilities, maybe more than just their immediate physical safety, although that could be a factor too, of course.
That's a really crucial distinction for understanding their specific experience. So, okay, with these complex dynamics, these profound impacts, how do the sources suggest victims, including men, can even begin to navigate the system, especially the legal system?
Yeah, that's where things get really challenging, according to the sources.
Mm.
Particularly those Reddit discussion threads,
Yeah.
from people actually trying to deal with this.
Right.
They highlight these immense difficulties.
Yeah.
Proving this kind of behavior in court, like the Hard Truth article and Reddit comments,
Mhm.
confirm it's just tough, primarily because it often lacks that clear physical evidence.
Mhm.
It frequently ends up being a kind of he said, she said situation, dealing with psychological, emotional manipulation,
Mm.
which is hard to pin down legally.
And those Reddit posts suggested that maybe the courts don't always get it, or maybe
Yeah.
don't take it as seriously.
That was definitely a common feeling expressed there. People felt that courts, maybe some legal professionals too, sometimes underestimate or just struggle to grasp the nuances of these ongoing nonviolent patterns. Some shared these really heartbreaking experiences of feeling like the system only seemed to care if there was obvious physical abuse or if a child was directly harmed physically, not necessarily recognizing the constant psychological damage and control as seriously.
So just going in and arguing coercive control might not actually be enough on its own.
The insights from Reddit suggested maybe not. The law often seems to require focusing on specific, provable actions or violations of existing court orders, rather than the overall pattern of control, which can be harder to evidence in a way the court accepts.
Okay, so given those challenges, what strategies do emerge from these sources for people trying to get help or legal protection?
Well, the absolute number one strategy, emphasized across the Hard Truth piece and the workshop material, is meticulous documentation.
Right, keeping records.
Yes, record everything, not just how you felt, but the specific incidents, dates, times, details of what happened, what was said, thinking in terms of timelines, incident logs. This helps shift it from purely emotional testimony towards a factual record, however imperfect.
Documentation as evidence, basically.
Exactly. And seeking professional validation can also be key. Getting therapists or doctors to document the psychological toll or any physical impacts from the stress, that can be vital evidence too, as suggested by Hard Truth.
Okay. And specifically within the legal system, like family court, Any advice there?
Yeah, the advice from the Reddit users who'd been through it was pretty clear. Focus your evidence on the child's best interest,
Ah, okay.
because that's the primary lens for family courts.
Hmm.
Show how the abuser's coercive behavior negatively impacts the child or the co-parenting relationship, rather than just focusing solely on how it impacted you as the adult victim. That framing can often be much more effective legally.
That's a really smart, strategic reframing.
It seems to be, yeah.
Yeah.
Other strategies mentioned included limiting contact with the abuser whenever possible, obviously,
Sure.
and using techniques like gray rock. Basically, making yourself emotionally unresponsive, boring, uninteresting to the abuser to try and minimize those manipulative interactions.
Mm-hmm.
That came up alongside the importance of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and one Reddit user also mentioned the potential value of bringing in expert witnesses, like maybe a forensic psychologist who specializes in coercive control, to help educate the court about these complex dynamics.
So there are strategies, but they clearly require a ton of effort, resilience, and maybe a pragmatic understanding of the system's limitations. What about finding just general support and trying to move forward?
Yeah, despite all the difficulties, the sources definitely point to essential paths for support. Maintaining communication with trusted friends and family that's highlighted by Healthline as absolutely vital to combat the isolation the abuser often creates.
And reaching out for professional help seems key.
Absolutely. Contacting domestic violence hotlines, support services, they can provide resources, guidance, safety planning. Healthline specifically mentions resource guides and directories like domestic shelters.
Right.
And it emphasizes that these resources are for anyone experiencing abuse, regardless of gender. That's an important point.
And creating a safety plan, you mentioned that. Sounds crucial.
It really is.
Yeah.
Especially because, as the sources indicate, the time when someone is planning to leave or has just left an abuser can actually be the most dangerous period. So having a plan is critical.
The workshop material also talked about documentation in a slightly different way, too, didn't it? Not just for court.
Yes, that was interesting. It described documentation not just as legal evidence, but also as a form of power for the survivor.
How so?
Well, it helps you reclaim your own story, validate your own experience, especially after potentially years of gaslighting, and it helps you communicate what you've been through more effectively to therapists, doctors, friends, anyone trying to support you. It's a tool for regaining agency.
That makes sense. And therapy and counseling are consistently recommended across the board.
Crucially important, yes. The sources, including those Reddit discussions mentioning CPTSD in the Hard Truth article, strongly recommend therapy to help victims process the trauma, understand what happened, and develop coping strategies for moving forward. And peer support is also mentioned as invaluable. Just connecting with others who truly understand what you've been through can combat that profound sense of isolation.
Finally, that UK report makes some bigger picture recommendations, right? For the sister itself.
Yes, it calls for what it terms a whole system approach.
Yeah.
Basically, comprehensive training for everyone involved, police, courts, social services, health professionals,
Okay.
so they can actually recognize and understand how men experience coercion, including those gender-specific tactics we talked about. Because without that understanding from professionals, the abuse just stays hidden or gets dismissed.
And a call for more public awareness, too.
Definitely. The report recommends awareness campaigns that accurately reflect male victimization, and importantly, campaigns that educate both the public and potentially abusive women about what coercive control actually is. The hope being, to shift societal attitudes and maybe even encourage some perpetrators to recognize their behavior and seek help to change it.
Wow. This deep dive into the sources has been, well, incredibly revealing. Coercive control is clearly this devastating, really complex form of abuse that definitely reaches across genders.
Yeah, the evidence we looked at strongly shows that male victims experience significant psychological and physical harm. And they often face these unique tactics centered around vulnerabilities like their relationship with their children and the very real threat of false allegations.
And while navigating the legal system clearly presents some major, often frustrating challenges in getting this kind of insidious abuse recognized,
Mhm.
the sources do highlight the power of that meticulous documentation, thinking strategically about presenting evidence, getting professional support, and really advocating for broader understanding as essential steps forward.
Ultimately, I think these sources really underscore that just recognizing the patterns, validating the reality and the impact of this abuse, regardless of who the victim is, who the perpetrator is, that's the absolute first step. The first step towards seeking support, reclaiming some agency, and starting that long, difficult process of recovery.
So after unpacking all of that, what does this really mean for you listening?
Well, maybe consider this. If coercive control can be so subtle, so invisible sometimes, and so difficult to prove, especially when it challenges our, traditional assumptions about who is a victim or who is a perpetrator, just how many experiences might be going completely unrecognized right now? And what responsibility do we all have, perhaps, in trying to shine a light on these hidden patterns and supporting those who might be trapped by them?